2016 to 2017 works by Alice Smith from Dwight's own collection were featured in an 18-month exhibit in Charleston at the Edmonston Austin House and at Middleton Place. As part of that endeavor, Dwight shared images and photographs from his family archives with the Charleston Magazine for a September 2016 main article on the artist. Dwight recently contributed an Alice Ravenel Huger Smith entry to the book Central to Their Lives, Southern Artist in the Johnson Collection, published by the University of South Carolina Press in this year, 2018. And most importantly, after a decade of writing, he has just completed a manuscript entitled Pursuing Perfection, Artistic Lessons of Alice Ravenel Huger Smith, a Southern Watercolorist, 1876 to 1958. He hopes to have it published in the not too distant future. And the notes I have here, keep your fingers crossed. We are really looking forward to Dwight sharing with us today heart and passion and love for an artist and art, and we're looking forward to it. Please join me in welcoming Dwight McInvaill.
Well, welcome today. I have to ask this question. How many of you are artists? Okay, quite a number of hands are going up. Well, to you especially, thank you for coming. Also, I know many of you are interested in Southern history, and this is replete with that. And I'm looking forward so very much to giving the presentation. A lot of the times I speak just off the cuff. This time I'm going to read carefully prepared notes because we only have an hour, and it takes a full hour to give this presentation. So hold on. Alice Ravenel Huger Smith was a highly creative individual who lived from 1876 to 1958, and who is known primarily for her watercolors of the South Carolina Lowcountry. She created wonderful artwork, especially watercolors from the 1910s to the 1950s, and was a leader of an important civic and cultural resurgence in South Carolina, mainly during the 1920s and the 1930s. This talk is made possible especially by material shared from private family collections, thanks to the generosity of Alice's great niece, Ann Gow Tinker, Alice's great nephew, William Mason Mady Smith, and Alice's cousin, Charles Dewell. It also incorporates scholarly materials and information from my family's archives, and I would like, again, to thank the Friends of the Georgetown Library for hosting this lecture today. Nearly 40 years ago, in a cabin in the woods on my grandparents' property in Conway, South Carolina, I found soon after my father's death over 400 letters to my parents from this artist, a lady who I thought I already knew quite well from stories, from photographs, and from the 20 or so watercolors on our home's walls. But I must admit, I've been trying to understand the fascinating flow of her creative processes ever since. I've recently completed a book on her entitled Pursuing Perfection, and it begins like this. "Open the windows of your mind to let in the fresh air," said Alice Ravenel Huger Smith to family members and to friends like my parents in an ever-encouraging manner. Committed fully to her exhortation, this energetic soul embraced studying and imparting art both passionately and impactfully. Her life's creative essence surged broadly and deeply throughout a cultural watershed of the American South. During years of practice and sharing, she transformed herself into a leading painter of an early 20th century civic resurgence. Scholars would later call it the Charleston Renaissance. This photo by my father of Alice Smith shows the artist in the midst of a low-country landscape, and this watercolor, Colorful Swamp, showcases Alice's exceptional abilities in a typical scene of cypress trees in still, cool water. Oops. Alice grew up in the last quarter of the 19th century in the warm embrace of an aristocratic Charleston neighborhood, south of Broad Street, with some very special relations. Her two anchors there were her grandmother, Eliza Carolina Middleton Huger Smith, nicknamed Dama, and her father, Daniel Elliott Huger Smith, who everyone knew as UG. They were, Alice said, the rocks against which the others rested. They were the great branching trees of the forest. Eliza Smith, as a former rice plantation mistress and a descendant of a signer of the Declaration of Independence, guided the family through hard Reconstruction days. At one point during this difficult post-Civil War period, 7 adults and 9 children lived together at 69 Church Street in what Alice described as a mixed-up household, although the number gradually shrank to about half that number, still a full household. When Alice was about 12 years old, her mother, Caroline R. Ravenel Smith, died from a lingering anemic illness. It may have seemed rather odd to some that Alice's grandmother, Dama, would then guide her granddaughter Alice, towards a career in art. For Alice was a true tomboy who, unlike her 2 sisters, Caroline and Lili, liked to roll off unlikely walls and roofs with her 2 brothers, Mason and Jamie. But Dama clearly saw the child's true talent, while perhaps recalling also Alice's great uncle, Charles Fraser, who had been an antebellum miniaturist and one of the preeminent ones, and a wonderful landscape painter himself. Alice's father, as a board member of the Carolina Art Association and as a keen lover of art, undoubtedly supported his mother's decision about Alice's future artistic studies. For as an international broker for a local cotton export firm, he sought out art wherever he journeyed worldwide. It was in the summer of 1873, he noted, that I made my first visit to Europe in the interest of my new firm. I was always in London before the exhibitions at the Royal Academy were closed, and I paid frequent visits to the permanent collections of pictures in London and at every other place that I visited. But I was never in Paris early enough for the Paris salons. Still, it is interesting to mark the development of things. I saw the electric light when first used on the Avenue de l'Opéra in Paris. Due to a boyhood plantation accident, Alice's father could only see really well with one good eye, but he obviously loved the visual realm immensely. From age 12 to 19, Alice studied at the Carolina Art Association School under Madame Lucy Louise Ferret, one of the late 19th century heroines of the revival of Southern art. Thank you very much. In weekly causeries, said Alice, she introduced us to training she had in Paris and the French outlook on art. This photo of Mademoiselle Ferret's art class in action shows Alice seated center right and positioned with a paintbrush in her raised right hand. Mademoiselle Ferret is on the far right. She inculcated in me the rule, said Alice, that watercolor should always be transparent and never to use opaque color. Although I broke away from many of her teachings, yet that precept I observe today, a half a century later. In one respect, I changed completely. Her sketches were small and very tight and dry, and my watercolors are large and distinctly the reverse of dry. As for the rendering of landscapes, Ferret likely referenced the work of the Barbizon school, which appears to be reflected in Alice's later illustrations for the book A Woman Rice Planter, 1913, and a Carolina Rice Plantation in the 50s, 1936, as shown in this view of Le Champ d'Alouette by Jules Breton, and this one of Palace by Alice. Ferret loved the intimate, everyday depictions by the 18th century French artist Chardin, which may have likewise influenced Alice's later depictions of rural life as shown here. Chardin, Alice. And here in these scenes of the hand milling of rice on a hillside, and of clothes boiling in cauldrons and being hung on a line. One of her fellow art classmates under Ferret's tutelage appears to have been her own first cousin, Sabina Elliott Wells, who Alice described as an inseparable companion of exactly my own age, though we generally approach topics from diverse angles. Sabina's diaries reveal that she and Alice found experimenting with art even as children to be a pleasurable, shared, regular pastime with other young ladies in their lower Church Street area. In hindsight, they likely engendered together some seeds of the Charleston Renaissance through girlish play in their intimate neighborhood. Alice and her relations sometimes walked for enjoyment together into the outlying countryside. When I was 16, Alice said, my father, my cousin Julian Wells, Sabina's older brother, and I started out one day and pushed on to Milton Place. With my father and my cousin, I did 15 miles there and 15 miles back. Milton Place was beautiful, a jewel thrown down in the green woods. We strolled through its paths under the great oaks, looking out across the fields and the river. Alice's love affair with Milton Place continued throughout her life. In one Milton Place sketchbook entitled Third Lake Steps and Causeway, she wrote, walk around the big oak, pale pink cream and light lavender. In shade, oak grays and browns, moss silvery gray, cedars very dark, light on edges, grass and azaleas bright, trees beyond bluish, magnolia brown and dark in the shade, camellia dark blue-green, silver reflections. But let's permit some Milton Place watercolors to speak for themselves. In her watercolor Springtime Reflection Pool at Milton Place, Alice showed around 1930 the beauty of the gardens as restored from 1925 onwards by her cousin, J.J. Pringle Smith, a transformation which resulted by 1941 in the highest award from the Garden Club of America. The loveliness in this work depends greatly upon the subtle interplay throughout of the complementary hues of rose and green and of lavender and yellow. The viewer's eyes drawn into the work again and again by Alice's understated repetition of a series of parallel, gently curving lines around the quiet reflection pool. J.J. Pringle Smith's daughter was Alice's cousin Josephine Scott Smith, the future mother of Charles Dewell, the current president of Milton Place. On October the 21st, 1933, she would marry Charles Halliwell Dewell of New York City. But in 1924, as she stood in the bough of this tree, depicted by Alice in her watercolor, Miss Josephine Smith in oak with peacock, that event was still years in the future. The beauty of this painting resides not only in Alice's rendering of the ethereal young lady, but also in the contrasting depiction of the strength of the massive tree's limbs and large root structure, as seen here. In this watercolor, Middleton Oak and Ricefield, with Miss Josephine Smith, Alice features likewise, in 1924, her young cousin once more, this time in a work which contrasts the near and the far, and the cool and the warm. Through the movement of the Spanish moss and the oak's firmament, Alice also offers us the experiences of an afternoon breeze, of the turning of the not-so-distant tide, a delightful time often in the South Carolina Low Country. A fourth Milton Place watercolor is Mill Pond and Butterfly Lake, painted by Alice in 1926. While this view is very representational of the actual South Battery Lake and rice mill at the base of the vast terraced lawn with the Ashley River beyond, the true theme of this painting is a heavy humidity, which softens this landscape of mainly water, river, marsh, and sky, perhaps at day's end. A lovely technical effect is Alice's rendering of trees and masses, which she did a lot, just behind the rice mill and then also on the horizon. The entire work is like a muted rainbow. In addition to nature, the cousins Alice and Sabina also had ready access to loveliness of another sort throughout urban Charleston. For more than a century and a half, the city's upper class had used enormous profits from indigo and then from rice to embellish the town with a beautiful architecture and art. While the Civil War fires and natural disasters of the mid to late 19th century had damaged much, a great many treasures remained extant behind their many relatives' well-locked gates and exclusive drawing rooms. Examples include these three works, which have since left Charleston for Moscow, Russia, for Boston, Massachusetts, and for Buffalo, New York. Goodbye paintings. Goodbye heritage. Alice loved the buildings too. She extolled in her reminiscences that the streets of Charleston carry you back to the old times. The houses remind you of members of a large family living harmoniously together, the old and the young standing side by side. She illustrated the beauty of her city's heart initially, most clearly, in her 20 drawings of the Pringle House on King Street, Charleston, South Carolina, which you can also see in our Georgetown County Digital website. She self-published in a loose folio format this book with a brief essay by her father in 1914. Almost immediately thereafter, from 1915 to 1917, Alice and her father collaborated intensively during a 2-year period, early each morning, really early each morning, she says, with coffee, doing daily research and writing on a manuscript, which was published in 1917 as The Dwelling Houses of Charleston, South Carolina. The importance of this work cannot be overestimated. It was hugely popular locally. It reestablished a sense of identity amongst the upper class of the city, and it helped to spur the establishment in Charleston of one of the first historic districts, if not the first historic district in America, protecting the architectural essence of the Holy City from the wrecking ball by preserving entire neighborhoods. And that took some doing. In 1901, Alice and Sabina became artistic participants in an ambitious undertaking, a veritable World's Fair on the outskirts of Charleston, the South Carolina Interstate and West Indian Exposition. Together, the cousins created a 16-page booklet entitled Verses from the Cotton Bowl by Henry Timrod, which became the official souvenir of the women's department of the fair. The publication featured a long poem, along with illustrations based on original Aubrey Vincent Beardsley style views of cotton fields, broad-winged birds, ocean waves, and so forth, reminiscent of the South Carolina Low Country. Sabina took full credit for it, with Alice as a silent collaborator. Alice and Sabina both had season's passes to the entire 6-month exposition, so they likely visited the Fine Arts exhibition repeatedly in the Palace of Arts, an imposing all-brick 3-story rectangular classical fireproof structure with an overall floor space of 7,000 square feet and with an open interior height of 30 feet, illuminated mainly by a very large skylight, 24 feet wide, running the entire length of the 140-foot building. I tell you what, that took some doing to find those statistics. The paintings therein were arranged in salon style, with paintings displayed not only side by side, but also above and below with one another to maximize the utilization of wall space. The assemblage encompassed 584 works, including samples of not only the traditional, but also the very best in modern American art from 1901. Highlights of the latter group included outstanding vibrant works of American Impressionism, such as William Chase's Idle Hours, Charles Hassam's Plaza Central Havana, and beautiful subdued paintings of American tonalism, such as Eugene Vale's Breton Sunday, Alfred Moray's Black Parasol, George Inness's Off the Coast of Cornwall, and Alexander Harrison's Marine at the end. In the summer of 1902, Alice and her older sister Caroline arrived in New York City. My sister Caroline wanted to study sightseeing in New York City, Alice noted, and I thought I could pick up a little knowledge there in something. Alice's sibling enrolled at the New York College of Music on East 58th Street. The college's neighborhood was an elite one. It contained a number of palatial homes, large public buildings, and relatively new post-Civil War Romanesque and Gothic structures, real modern architecture there, with high towers and grand brick and stone facades. The school was located 1.5 miles from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This collection could be easily accessed by foot within 30 minutes or so down Fifth Avenue or through Central Park. No problem at all for Alice Smith, the long hiker to Midland Place. Amongst the new paintings on loan to the museum then was On the Seine by Claude Monet, That's not surprising since the city's artistic community was abuzz about Monet's garden scenes and their different conditions of light, like the variations in his earlier haystacks. Alice could have also viewed in the Metropolitan Museum of Art's permanent collection many other wonderful paintings. The brilliant light silver, blue, and gold of Joseph Turner. Camille Corot's delicate pattern of silhouetted branches across a pewter sky. The blue, violet, and golden colors of fall, interplayed strikingly by George Ennis. A magical gray-blue evening mood in a watercolor by William Trost Richards. And Tom Kensett's shades and hues of rose and olive sky at day's end with reflections on water. Isn't that particularly lovely? Yeah. In the boarding house in which my sister and I resided in New York, wrote Alice in her reminiscences, was Miss Cecile Payan, who gave me lessons in miniature painting. She was not long back from China, where she had been caught in the Boxer Uprising. During the lesson, she told me of the long siege of the British legation, where she and other Americans had taken refuge, and of its terrors and privations. Alice's interest in miniatures took a scholarly route as she became an expert on the related miniature work of her ancestor, the aforementioned Charles Fraser. She also provided considerable impetus to the Gibbs in its later collecting of miniatures, resulting in 3 key exhibits in the 1930s and in a nationally esteemed collection now of over 600 miniature portraits at the present. Alice also began painting portraits, as evidenced by this 1944 photo of herself and her sister Caroline taken by my father beneath their father's image. And so here we have Cecile Payan's work, here we have Alice's miniature, and then here we have her father that she painted. And here her father is again, along with 2 of her relatives. Upon her return home, Alice began producing portraiture, that favorite of Charlestonians, thus perpetuating a long-standing tradition. In a small volume published on the occasion of her 80th birthday, 26 portraits are listed for the period 1902, right after she got back from New York, to 1915. According to art scholar Martha R. Severance, her most successful portraits were those of children and women closer to her own age, done from life and with a freer use of the transparent watercolor method. She produced and sold miniatures also. These 3 portraits are family members. The watercolor of Alice's father, on the far side, has the appearance of an oil painting done in shades of brown and gold. He holds glasses and a book as emblems of scholarship. Alice's sister Caroline, closest to me, exhibits a confident, direct look. And Alice's niece, another Caroline, gazes at her aunt intently as if to inquire, "What's this about?" In later years, Alice and this particular niece would continue to be very lovingly direct with one another. While doing family portraits, Alice also began to document carefully African-American rice workers. She was steered in this direction initially by the author Owen Wister, who told her that images of these laborers would soon become rarer than those of Native Americans, since rice production in the South Carolina Lowcountry appeared to soon be ending. For generations, African Americans before and after the Civil War had been expert growers of this crop, initially as enslaved individuals and later as free men and women. Alice saw their confident expertise in action from her childhood in the 1870s after the Civil War to the end of commercial rice production in the mid-1920s, a 50-year period. She admired their gullah culture and their agricultural skills and achievements. In a diary entry in 1898, Alice's cousin Sabina captured in words as well some of the spirit of those times after the Civil War. "All hands were at work trying to remove the old trunk," she wrote, "preparatory to putting down a new one. The women regarded it as a great picnic, and both the men and the women were singing or shouting and were pulling away on the rope, and whenever there was a pause, there would be joking or laughter. One of the women, she noted in another entry, was magnificently made. She had a tremendous chest, and with her head well back, and like many others, wore a white cloth over it like a Moorish headdress. The cloth is simply square, part of one side of which is pinned at the back, acting like a tight band, straight around the head, with all the rest falling back free. As she sat on a high bench, waiting for the boat to go over to the rice fields, she looked like a splendid statue. Pula Plantation in Berkeley County on the west branch of the Cooper River across the water from Strawberry Chapel was particularly important to Alice in her research concerning rice plantation life, and the flora and fauna of the South Carolina low country landscape too. It was the home of Mr. and Mrs. Francis William Hayward and their children, the boys Nathaniel and Joseph, and the girls Maria, who Alice called Marie, and Jeannie and Pachita. The Smiths and the Haywards had been friends for generations, and Alice and Marie had formed a close relationship at the Mrs. Sass's school in Charleston. Alice visited the Hayward family at Pula Plantation in some manner from at least the 1890s to 1926. From about 1913 to 1926, she may have done so intensively in an artistic way. For 9 Novembers, according to Marie in one source, Alice came to Pula to study the plantation and the surrounding area intensively. In another source, Marie mentioned 12 years of such focused visits. Alice also indicated that she stayed at the Hayward home each spring too. During this period, in addition to the fall, as indicated by these photos from the archives of the Gibbs Museum of Art, the youngsters often made excursions into the countryside together, by foot, by boat, and by carriage. In her Pula sketchbook, No1, circa 1917, Alice drew views of the rice fields. She also analyzed closely the hand milling of rice by sketching the process in detail over 50 times. She also rendered scenes of nearby waterways in Sketchbook No1, including this river outlook and this view of fishing poles at the end of a rickety pier. She also showcased beautiful images of trees and masses in Sketchbook No1. During 1 week in the prime of her life spent on Bull's Island, she wrote this passage in a sketchbook. I think I must be a throwback to a pioneer forefather. I feel at home sitting in a wet and muddy boat, scrambling up on banks and hummocks to lighten the boat, soaking wet with the dew and then scorching in the sun, looking at the raised head of an alligator swimming and carrying his tail above the water, or at a deer peeping through the grasses and palmettos, or listening to the gallinule's plaintive calling and splashing. Beautiful. Alice and Sabina and other members of the Cousins social set shared a technological passion at the start of the 20th century, photography. Alice used photography as well as sketchbooks to document the South Carolina low country plantations, as indicated by Alice's snapshots of the African Americans Henry Myers, Charity, and Jonas and Jake. A number of other similar photos are in the Gibbs Museum of Art's archives, and in my book I document precisely the African American models that she used. Alice's cousin Bessie, Elizabeth Alston Pringle, at Chicora Wood Plantation in Georgetown County, also yearned to take some lessons in photography and to buy a good camera. She wanted to illustrate in this manner, as she put it, the odd and picturesque things I so constantly see. Her lack of skills limited this outcome. As she lamented in A Woman Rice Planter, 1913, I am so stupid about the films. I cannot put them in myself, and I'm so afraid of spending an unnecessary cent that for months my Kodak is of no use to me. It would be such a delight if I could only once learn its intricacies. By the end of the 20th century's first decade, Bessie's cousin Alice appears to have had no such technical hesitations. Alice used photography as a basis for many of the 88 drawings that she did as illustrations for A Woman Rice Planter, 1913. Here's an example involving Anna and Mathilde from a snapshot transformed into Saul's wife Aphrodite in a sketch for the book. A comparison of the photo with the drawing shows nearly no variance. Alice only neatens a curtain in the window and removes a rag from the steps and a board from the ground. The rest remains nearly unchanged. At least 10% of Alice's drawings in A Woman Rice Planter 1913 came directly from photographs as shown by these examples of the images. Alice's usage of snapshots as a basis for artwork is not surprising, since artists such as Picasso, Degas, Gauguin, Munch, Bonnat, Vuillard, Lafage, and many others did so as well. In Art and Photography 2001 by Aaron Scharf, and in The Artist and the Camera, Degas to Picasso 1999 by Dorothy Kosinski, and in Snapshot, Painters in Photography, Bonnat to Vuillard 2011, this reality is explored more fully in a scholarly manner. Decades later, the book, A Carolina Rice Plantation in the 50s, 1936, was also a family affair. Alice's father contributed to it his boyhood memories of Smithfield Plantation on the Combahee River, Colleton County, South Carolina, from the 1850s. Cousin Herbert Sass provided this historical narrative, and Alice did 30 paintings in watercolor for its illustrations. If one counts additionally the elegant views of rice fronds on the cover, then you come up with that total of 30. Some people just say 29. Moreover, Alice's cousin by marriage, Charles Duell, not the current one, but his father, as indicated by this signature page from Alice's copy of the book, guided the book through the publishing and publicity process of William Moore and Company, New York. He was assisted in this process by Charlotte Ripley Dillingham, also a Charleston, South Carolina native. Cousin Herbert Ravenel Sass had stepped in to help Alice complete this book upon the 1932 death of her father. Throughout her life, she enjoyed collaborating with him, particularly on endeavors dealing with nature. He is, she wrote, such a masterly writer in the description of the country that he is, to my mind, the country itself. What he tells in his stories I've seen and tried to paint. I can follow him as he wanders and dreams by the seashore or through the fields. Alice's copy, which I have, of A Carolina Rice Plantation of the 50s, 1936, featured these two special watercolor inserts: a winnower with a fanner basket and a plantation lady with child. Alice used photographs as a basis for many of the watercolors in A Carolina Rice Plantation in the 50s. Her painting, The Mill and Barn, for instance, appears to have its origin in a montage of 3 snapshots as shown here, with 2 comprising the background of the work and the 3rd influencing the foreground of the watercolor. These photographs generally are now in 3 archives: the Gibbs Museum of Art, the South Carolina Historical Society, and the Charleston Museum. While there could be other such photos, my research shows that those snapshots by Alice, and possibly by her relatives and friends, because they were all just clicking like mad at that time, influenced nearly 30% of Alice's illustrations in A Carolina Rice Plantation in the 50s. All of these. From the beginning of the 20th century until at least 1956, Alice exhibited her work in 5 studios, the first behind her home, the next 3 on Chalmers Street, and the 5th on Atlantic Avenue, and the last again on Chalmers Street. The work done was steady and full of effort, she wrote. The visitors were also very numerous, for in addition to my painting, I was involved in historical work with my father, and many came to ask about the houses and about the history. Also, I knew something about rice planting, for I spent a great deal of time at Wapula, the plantation belonging to the Frank Haywards on the Cooper River. Thus, I had the 3 approaches to tourist questions: artistic knowledge, historical, and rice planting, and all of which I was very deeply interested. They all tied together. Each led up to the other. And these are some artifacts from her studio. Many members of the creative class of her time from all corners of the nation came to her studio, since they hungered, then as now, for authentic locations and meaningful experiences. The history, the people, lived for me, said Alice. They were never bits of history, they were life. All of this perhaps showed in my work and drew people to my studio, such as Paul Manship, Bertha Jacques, Cass Gilbert, Helen Hie, the people and some of their works. And they came in droves. There are cascades of calling cards. When some creative persons visited Alice, they exchanged artistic insights with her. Helen Hie, for instance, was such a symbiotic personage. As the first American female artist to study and to create in Japan, she had much to teach generally about Oriental art, and specifically about Japanese woodblock prints. Based on the recommendation of artist Anna Hayward Taylor, Helen Hie visited Cousin Bessie at Pula Plantation as a paying guest in 1916. You got to remember they had no money at that time, so they were doing anything that they could to make money. Okay, so she took in paying guest, Cousin Bessie. Cousin Bessie then directed her to Alice. And while learning printmaking from Helen Hie, Alice undoubtedly also influenced her, as indicated by Hie's work from that time, particularly Cypress Swamp and also maybe Rainy Day in South Carolina, and perhaps also Home of Gabriel. Helen Hie did works like feeding the geese when she did Oriental scenes, so maybe not so much there. Even earlier, in 1908, another key influence on Alice arrived in Charleston, artistic teacher Burch Harrison. He would return there regularly throughout the next 2 decades. As a member of the tonalists, he advocated the creation of art and attention to elegant poetic moods through the careful usage of lines, textures, and observation. His basic method was to teach conversationally, as attested to by Alice. Every now and then, she wrote, he would drop in to see me and talk, which amounted to teaching in a casual way. In his classic teaching text, Landscape Painting, 1909, he emphasized the importance of creative vision, the power of atmospheric techniques, the value of focusing on the whole over the parts, and the subtle interplay of adjacent color masses, as in the works of English masters like John Constable. Such Charleston works as these by Harrison showcase what Alice was likely learning from him in 1908. Around 1909, according to my parents, Alice Smith fell in love. 4 years her senior, Maud Alston Reed was a distant Virginian cousin. His mother was a Charlestonian. He graduated from Harvard University, studied in Munich, Germany, did geological excursions throughout the continent, taught at Harvard, Radcliffe, and MIT, and served as a member of the Continental Congress of Geologists in Washington, Russia, and Paris. He was afflicted by arthritis. This condition it was, wrote Alice's father, which in the full vigor of his life broke off his professional career and compelled his retirement to his Texan ranch outside of Houston in the hope that an active out-of-door life might assist his powers of resistance. Finding this hope a vain one, he made his home in Charleston and resigned himself to the sedentary life of his library, where his mental activities and the accruement and arrangement of knowledge continued, even though his own productiveness became daily more limited by pain and loss of physical powers. Visits to this library were constant pleasures to his friends, for they found no regrets for lost opportunities and no complaints over present disabilities. In place of these, they met an active interest in current events, a keen intelligence, a superb memory, and a readiness to discuss the great movements of the intellectual world, whether in science, history, or in art. For amongst his acquirements was a knowledge and developed taste in the last, art, which enabled him to form for his own pleasure a fine collection of Japanese color prints, now held by the Gibbs Museum of Art. As Alice noted, the study of these prints was not only of their beauty and interest, but with Alston, I read a number of books, and through him, I met some very interesting people. It is likely that Alice also studied with Alston the 11th century Chinese artist Kaki's essay on landscape and Fenellosa's epics of Chinese and Japanese art, that Alice proclaimed she not only read, but knew from cover to cover. Kaki had said, "What a delightful thing it is for lovers of forests and fountains and friends of mist and haze to have at hand a landscape painted by a skillful artist, so that if the artist paints with a careless heart, it is like throwing dirt upon the deity or casting impurities into the clear wind." This, wrote Alice, became my artistic Bible. These 2 beautiful watercolors by Alice evidence clearly the ongoing influence of Japanism in her work across many years. They are Blue Herons in Flight on the far side from 1933, and nearly 2 decades later, Shrimp Catcher from about 1952. Beautiful works. Japanism can also be seen in these much earlier works by Alice from 1920. They are both entitled Dogwood Blossoms. They recall the illustration Trees by Kano Shushu in the aforementioned book Epics of Chinese and Japanese Art. They also remind one of the transitory nature of life, and additionally of the death of Maud Alston Reed in the summer of 1920. He was buried in Magnolia Cemetery on July the 4th, 1920, Alice's 46th birthday. But an ongoing center of stability in Alice's long life was her elder brother Mason, aka William Mason Smith. They keep the same names for generations. Who actually outlived her. As a very successful corporate lawyer in New York, not only did he fund the upkeep of the Charleston homestead at 69 Church Street, but he also helped underwrite some of Alice's artistic and literary endeavors, such as a major art show in Manhattan in 1949 and the publication of the Mason Smith family letters in 1950. He was joined in this by his wife, Mary. Alice had a way of enticing her brother and his family to return to Charleston by writing him lovely letters during the harsh northern winters, describing the warmth and sunny landscape of South Carolina low country. As she once told my father, I think the contrast is too much for him. Alice also enjoyed visiting her brother and his family at their home at Dogan Hill, Staten Island. From an upstairs window there, Alice liked to see the Statue of Liberty. In 1912, Alice wrote a special book for Mason's children, Caroline, Eleanor, and Mason Jr., another Mason, there have been 4 or 5, about a heron nesting island near Charleston. Consisting of a long poem by Alice, illustrated by original watercolors, it is described in a general way. For youngsters, an actual environmental success story. After becoming aware that a heron nesting island was in danger of being destroyed by men killing birds for hat plumes and by farmers planting crops too, a group of citizens, including Alice and her cousin Herbert, had banded together to purchase the island, which they did, and to place it under the protection of the Charleston Museum, which they accomplished. While gifting this book to the Mason Smith's youngsters, particularly to her niece Caroline, the one with whom she sometimes butted head, as a birthday present, Alice also submitted it to 2 publishers with the help of the wife of her younger brother Jamie, who then lived also, like his older brother, in New York City. This sister-in-law, Mabel Shippey Clark Smith, was a successful author, but this attempt then failed. But fortunately, the Heron book has recently been published by Alice's great niece and great nephew, and it is available for purchase at the Gibbs Museum of Art and at other similar cultural institutions in Charleston. At the end of the poem, Alice revealed that she had based at least one of the illustrations in this book also on a photograph. It was of Cousin Herbert and these 2 birds. Alice's brother Mason had various sides. As a formidable legal mind, he had served as the chairman of the executive committee of the Association of the Bar of the City of New York. Additionally, he loved birds, music, poetry, gardens, noted his granddaughter, Anne Gautinka. He had a beautiful rose garden, she said, with different kinds of roses. To connect better with nature on his trip south, he purchased O'Hare's Point, which he called River Bend on the Wando River. Alice visited him there regularly, of course, sketching many scenes, and from them she created the watercolor Woods at River Bend on the Wando River in 1936. This was her brother's favorite painting. In a departure from her watercolors, Alice also painted for the interior of the River Bend house a number of oil paintings on thin mahogany wood panels, such as this composition, Birds Alighting on Lily Pads. Notebooks in the archives of the Gibbs Museum of Art chronicle that Alice did such panels for others too, evidently during the period from 1935 to 1945. In addition to law and nature, another of Mason's passions was sailing. Seen here is the races in Mattapoisett that she painted in 1927 when she visited him at his vacation place in Massachusetts. Alice honored Mason's love of racing by writing a poem which she illustrated by several watercolors, The Start and Rounding the Buoy and the aforementioned Home Stretch. Throughout her life, Alice enjoyed writing poems ranging from piscatorial sport about fishing with the Hayward sisters at Wapula, to these verses to accompany paintings of the dinghy race in Mattapoisett Harbor, and so forth. In 1943, the sharing of poetry with a young naval ensign, my dad, would lead to another dimension in her already very full life. very full personal and creative life. From about June 1941 onwards, 6 months before the Japanese attack upon Pearl Harbor, as scholar Fritz Hammer has noted, there commenced a rapid expansion of the Charleston Naval Yard. That growth and the coming of the war led in Charleston to an acute housing shortage. The federal government listed Charleston as one of 18 cities known as congested production areas. South of Broad Street, the city's elite responded by renting or providing 90% of their spare rooms and apartments in their aristocratic homes near the Battery to servicemen, their families, and war workers. Alice and her sister Caroline also opened their home to the military men. But the hospitality was given freely. It was never a money-making venture. The sisters filled the large second-floor drawing room of 69 Church Street with bedding. And Alice hid away her beloved Japanese artwork for the war's duration so as not to offend the servicemen.
Oh, yeah.
In June 1941, even 6 months before America's entry into World War II, as the military buildup began, Alice and Caroline were already patriotic entertaining and housing military men in their home. My father, Harry Clemson McInvaill Jr., was invited there to read some poetry. And from that dinner, a friendship was born that evolved into a business relationship of sorts. And after the war, they went to business together at the Pink House on Chalmers Street, which was in a way, during that last decade, sort of a group studio of all of the artists of what is now called the Charleston Renaissance. I do wish I could have brought some of the paintings. Too bad weather. The Smith sisters were always a very welcoming presence at 69 Church Street. And when Harry proposed to Tallulah Lemon, my mother, he did so in August 1944 on the chaise lounge in the Yellow Room at the back of the Smiths' home, directly below the portrait of Alice's flock, very much in the fire. When my father went to the Pacific to fight, Alice wrote him long letters about art and the creative process. Concurrently, she taught my mother watercolor lessons by mail. The result was not only over 400 letters from Alice Smith to these young people, but also the revival of her own artistic talents, which had been suspended from about 1939 to 1944 by her older sister Lili's medical problems and then by war. In one letter to Harry in the Pacific on May the 14th, 1945, her topic, for instance, was the exuberance of artistic creativity. How glad I am that your thoughts are singing and your words are singing. I know so well that feeling, one thought crowding on another. I used to say my head is bursting with pictures. And now here you come with your sheaf full of sonnets. I think I expected to paint everything lovely I saw. I know I wanted to, but I never painted all I wished. How could I? I cannot tell you how often I used to fight sleep, night after night, so that I could imagine the great birds sweeping down in the light, over the sea, over the trees, crossing the moon, lit by the sun, or the small birds playing with the flowers, or the depths of the pine woods, or the depths of the swamps, or the moss and the lilies. In another letter to Tallulah and Conway on June the 20th, 1945, her topic was this watercolor lesson. Don't forget, dearest, a full brush full with color. Do not let your color become anemic. If it is a pale tint, let it be because you want a pale tint, not because your brush was not able to give you a fresh, clear tone. Make your color glow. A dry brush gives a dull, dry color. Paint, when possible, with the side of the brush. This is accomplished by pressing down with a full brush. Your temptation is to pick away with the dry tip of the brush. Try to do it with one stroke and not be obliged to return and fuss over it. These are my fundamental rules for watercolor painting. Listen to this, artists. I think that you will find it easier to paint with a freer, fuller, more comprehensive stroke. I do. As wedding presents, Alice gave Harry and Tallulah a number of works, including these two watercolors from her classic pre-World War II period. One is After the Storm at Folly Beach, which hung for years above a fireplace in the upstairs drawing room of 69 Church Street, as you can see. And the other is Lotus in the Great Lake Reserve, which was displayed in that same room behind Alice's sister's grand piano, which you can see in one of the photos just over there, second photo from the top. The friendship of Alice with the McInvaills continued for 14 years until her death in 1958. It is illustrated by hundreds of photos. During this time, Alice's art became increasingly abstract and symbolic, although of course forever beautifully expressive of the South Carolina Low Country. It should be noted that Alice was supremely generous. She helped her African-American cook Delia to buy a house, for instance. And when it became apparent that my dad would not be able to work due to a chronic condition, she left enough money in her will for all of us to go to college.
Wow.
4 kids.
Oh, wow.
As a young infant, Harry helped Alice in the final editing of the Mason Smith family letters and used some of his contacts as an alumnus of the University of South Carolina to make the new press there aware of it. Alice also persuaded Alice in 1950 to write her reminiscences, which she dedicated to him. And my artistic biography of Alice, entitled Pursuing Perfection, will build upon this tradition of documenting the influences of family and friends upon this fascinating artist. Thank you so very much for this opportunity to share with you some works by Alice Smith, along with some scholarly and personal insights for my upcoming artistic biography of her life and times. We did it with 3 minutes to spare, so we have 3 minutes for questions. Well, okay.
Dwight, would you back it up one slide, because we're curious if that's you and your sister in this picture.
Oh,
there.
Yes, that's all. That's the entire group, all of us kids, and and we look so sweet there. But if you blew up the image, you would see my sister has a evil demon face. I have this, and I look like this. My sister Eve is saying, because she knows that we're being very bad. My sister Sarah is the only one that's precious. The others are just devils. And that's Alice and my sister Sarah, the little one, and Eve. And there they are dancing in the bamboo garden. And that's one of my dad's friends, Dan Dancer, from out in the Midwest. And he was there visiting in 1947. They were Navy buddies. And here's my grandmother and Alice's sister, and my dad and Alice. Again in the bamboo garden. And there's Manny and Allison and her sister Caroline and my little sister Alice. And Manny was a real rock. He was the one who really made all of Alice's paintings in her later life possible, because he carefully drove her all around the South Carolina Low Country.
Oh, wow.
And there, of course, that's that photo. They're in the upstairs drawing room, which, of course, during World War II had become a bivouac center for troops, but then it had been reconverted back in 1944, and that's a group of students from Conway High School. My grandmother was an English teacher there, and she brought them there. And the painting that I reference here as one of the wedding presents is behind the group there, and that's another picture of my sister Alice. My sister Eve, and the two sisters in the bamboo garden behind 69 Church Street. Thank you for the question. Who's next?
Dwight, what is the name of your book, and when is it going to be
Oh,
published?
just Pursuing Perfection, The Artistic Lessons of Alice Ravenel Huger Smith, a Southern watercolorist.
Would you slow down just a little bit?
Oh. I had to talk really fast to get through. You all realize that, don't you?
Pursuing Perfection.
Pursuing Perfection, The Artistic Lessons of Alice Ravenel Huger Smith, a Southern watercolorist. 1876 to
I bet it will
1958.
be for sale in a library's signing.
Oh, I'm not going to abuse my position at all, but if the staff is about 100 copies, what am I to do?
So when is it going to be published?
It's in the long desert.
Right now, I'm in negotiations.
You're in negotiations.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Did Alice live alone or with her sister all of her life, or did she have to have help?
She lived in the same house all of her life. She went to the hospital for her heart and died within 2 days. So,
How old was she?
She at that time would have been about 82. But the family actually lived far longer, but generally, but she lived to be 82.
How old were you when she passed?
I was I'm a 1950s baby also, like you. I found that out. Oh no, I'm so sorry. I'm mistaken. You're a 1970s baby.
You were right the first time.
So
Did you overlap with her? Do you have memories of her?
Well, physically overlap, and I do have memories, two memories. I have memories of her being in Myrtle Beach because Manny would bring her up to Myrtle Beach in a great big car they had, a huge old car. And so I remember going with her to the beach. And then I remember, it could have been this visit, but it was a similar visit to this when she was much less robust. Her health had declined very quickly. And I remember, them telling me not to grab her like it was wont to do. And also to be careful. But I remember that on that particular day, she told me about a carriage going past the street. We had a conversation about that. So I have more memories of her sister, Caroline. Caroline had Alzheimer's, so she was, going down that terrible path, even when Alice was alive. But she lived to be, I think, 98 years old. So she lived well into the 1960s, and we went there. And she was, it's a condition which progresses at different rates, and she remained very stable for many years, and so we were able to go down and to visit with her in her home, and then eventually she did have to go to a home, but she was always surrounded by people. Yes?
Where are the paintings now that are owned by your family?
They were all in the possession of my mother, of course, when she died, and she used to have Coastal Carolina University students come by to take a look at them. Then with their 4 children, two of my sisters, Alice and Sarah, decided to sell their paintings. And, but the Johnson Foundation bought a large number of them, so those are available to be seen on the website of the Johnson collection, and which is very good. But a few of them are somewhere out there, okay? But before my mother passed away, she and I had a professional photographer to take photographs. And I hope at some point, with the permission of the Smith family, that retains copyright, as you artists know, to anything that an artist produces for a certain period of time, which will expire in about 12 years from now, that they will give us permission to put some of those on the Georgetown County Digital website. And because I have really good copies, really good photographs of all of the collection. So, but I have a portion of the collection. My sister, even in Switzerland, has a portion of the collection too. And well, one of the fun things about writing the book is I really wanted to experience the artwork that Alice knew myself. So when the great crash happened in 2008, I decided, heck with this, I'm not putting my money in stocks. And so I started just buying art. And so, and I buy it wherever I can find it. I'm not too proud to buy it on eBay. And the other day I found a pastel by Elizabeth O'Neill Verner for only $340.
Oh, wow.
But what I missed 2 weeks ago, I didn't see it. There was another Charleston Renaissance artist, not at the top rank, but at the secondary rank. One of her works of flower ladies in front of St. Michael's. $58. They don't know what they're selling. So yeah, I check eBay all the time, and I'm not going to tell you the other places that I check. I've got a good collection now, a beautiful collection. A beautiful collection. Any other questions, folks? Yes, sir. It is still there. It has changed in the far corner where Heather is, on the bottom row. At the very last picture is a picture of what it looked like during her lifetime. It's a what is it called, a double house? What do they call it?
Duplex.
You have single houses and you have
Townhouses.
Double house.
a double house, okay. It's a double house, and townhouse is good, but it's a double house in which if you drew a line down the middle of it, half would be here, half would be there. Whereas a single house is one of these skinnier ones that they kind of have. And but the double house, they had added a piazza, 3-story porch. And because they did that, they decided to move the door on this side, and you'll see that back there. The present house, the door has been restored to the middle, the piazzas have been taken off. And the reason for that is they did also some opening up of walls on the inside. They didn't know what they were doing. So the integrity of the house, the frame was becoming worse and worse because they had taken out some key parts of the frame. And the piazza was also pulling on the frame. So they wisely repaired all of the damage after Alice was gone.
You referred to a Georgetown County website when you were talking about the dwelling houses at Charleston. You mean Georgetown County Library, or?
Thank you so much, very much for mentioning that. It's the Georgetown Digital Library. Isn't that www.gcdigital.org?
gcdigital.org.
Thank you so much. And so in any case, Joy and Julie work on that, and we have over 40,000 images, newspaper images, photographs, documents from a wide variety, from about 10 organizations here, museums and other sites, and it's very worthwhile to go see it. But it also now, and I don't know why, it has an Alice Smith section. Thank you so very much.
That was great.
I appreciate it.